Are the gospel accounts historically reliable? The gospel accounts in the New Testament are the most detailed sources we have about Jesus from the time period. So understanding if these sources, the most detailed sources we have about Jesus, are historically reliable is going to go a long way in helping us understand what we should make about Jesus. Welcome to the Torah Guide Podcast Evidence for Jesus series. In this series, we're talking about the evidence for Jesus and understanding what we should really make of him. I'm really excited for the series. I told you guys before because I'm a Jewish person who believes in Jesus. And in this series, I'm showing you the same evidence that originally convinced me that Jesus really is who he said he is. Now, I just want to put out there that we're looking at evidence that's in the Bible. We're looking in this episode, we're looking at evidence from sources that are inside the Bible. Now, I want to make it really clear. We're not using the Bible to prove the Bible. Using the Bible to prove the Bible is when you take something that's in the Bible, and then you expect people who may or may not believe that the Bible is legitimate. They might not believe that the Bible is the Word of God, but you believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And you say, look, it's in the Bible, you have to believe it. That's not what we're doing. Instead, what we're doing is we're recognizing the Bible for what it is. And the Bible, specifically the New Testament, is a gathering together of sources that communities gathered together, communities of people who believed in Jesus, gathered together these sources that they believed were the earliest and most accurate representations of what really took place. So what we're doing is we're just evaluating if that's really the case. We're evaluating if they really are early sources, and we're evaluating if the events that they say happened actually took place, if the authors were trying to communicate what happened honestly, or if they were being deceitful. So the one end of the spectrum says, you have to believe it because it's the Word of God. That means it's historically accurate. That doesn't really do too much for someone who doesn't really believe that the Bible is the Word of God yet. First, you need to show that the documents inside are historically reliable. The other end of the spectrum is just as bad. The other end of the spectrum is saying we're going to ignore everything in the Bible as a source entirely. When you're doing history, you have to deal with the sources you have. You can't just ignore sources because you don't like them. So what we're doing is we're treating the individual contents in the Bible for what they really are, and we're evaluating their historical reliability. So our first question is, are the gospel accounts in the New Testament early or are they late? Are they reliable historical sources based on their dating? Most New Testament critics, not all New Testament scholars, but critical scholars of the New Testament, place the Gospels after AD 70. And there's wide agreement that Mark is the first gospel, the earliest gospel. Because when you look at the other Gospels, it's clear that they use Mark as a reference. They reference Mark as they're writing their accounts. So it's accepted that Mark is the first Gospel. And most scholars place Mark after AD 70. But they all do agree, for the most part, that all of the Gospels, all four that are in the New Testament, were circulating by 150. So that means critical scholarship, again, not all scholarship, but critical scholarship, places the Gospel accounts between AD 70 and AD 150. Now, I just want to pause right there and say, what if that's true? What if the Gospels really were written in between AD 70 and AD 150? Would they still be reliable historical sources, or would they be just not credible as historical sources? And if you watched the first episode, you remember that we talked about the Roman Emperor Tiberius, the most famous, powerful man alive during Jesus' lifetime. And we talked about the main sources for his life, not the only sources, but the main sources for Tiberius' life are Tacitus and Suetonius. And Tacitus and Suetonius wrote 80 to 90 years later after Tiberius' life. So this is the same ballpark as AD 70 to AD 150. So if we accept Tacitus and Suetonius as reliable sources for Tiberius' life, and we do, then we should certainly accept the Gospels if they were written between AD 70 and AD 150 as reliable sources as well. Especially because Mark would be on the earlier end of that spectrum, because they're all circulating by 150 and they all had to reference Mark. So Mark is circulating around AD 70 if this is the case. So even accepting the critical scholarship's approach, these Gospels are still early and we should still consider them reliable accounts. However, I want to show you that placing the Gospels after the year AD 70 is based on really flawed reasoning from the bottom up. So the reason that the critics place Mark after AD 70 is because in the book of Mark, Jesus correctly prophesied that the temple was going to be destroyed, and the temple was destroyed in AD 70. So if you already reject, you do not believe that Jesus could do something like this, you disagree with what the accounts tell you about Jesus, you've decided you don't agree with it, then you would say he wouldn't have been able to do that, so the author must have added this in, which means the author wrote after the year 70. So they've already decided that Jesus is not capable of what the book of Mark claims Jesus is capable of, and they say the author must have written about that after the fact, after it actually took place in history, which means that this book, Mark, was written after AD 70. Then the logic goes, all of the other Gospels, because they reference Mark, are also after AD 70. But I want to show you that this line of reasoning is based on an assumption. It's based on the assumption that Jesus is not capable of what the Gospel says he's capable of, and then it builds the reasoning on top of that assumption. However, this totally sidesteps all of the evidence that we actually do have. There is a whole collection of evidence that says that the Gospel is before the year AD 70. This just assumes that it's wrong about who he is and builds a line of reasoning on that assumption, but it ignores actual evidence that we really have. So here's the evidence we have about when the book of Mark was actually written. So first, I want to address a myth. There is a widespread myth. It's actually one of the most common comments that people like to comment on our videos on social media when we talk about evidence for Jesus. They say nobody knows who wrote the gospel accounts. They're completely anonymous. The half-truth in this myth is that in the text of the gospel accounts, meaning in the actual accounts themselves, the authors do not identify themselves as the author. But the myth is that nobody knew originally who wrote them and they were just kind of spreading. Nobody knew who they were attached to. This ignores the evidence we have. So I told you I'm going to tell you the evidence, so here it is. All of the earliest manuscripts that we have found, meaning manuscripts are just the early copies of the Gospels we have. Nobody knows if we have the originals or not. We probably do not have the original manuscripts of the Gospels, but we have early copies of the Gospel accounts. We call these manuscripts. So all of the earliest manuscripts, 100% of the early manuscripts that we've recovered include attributions to the authors, which means all the evidence we have says that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors that are attached to the Gospels in their name. Now remember, the church during the early period is not one unified organization. This doesn't take place for a couple hundred years. So these are individual communities that have contact with each other, but they're not one organization. If the Gospels were anonymous, if people didn't know who they came from, you would expect different names because people are guessing who they came from. But the church in all these different communities all over the place have the same names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attached to them. Not only does all of the earliest manuscript evidence say that Mark is the author of the gospel in his name, but there's unanimous attribution that Mark is the author of his gospel by the 2nd century AD. Papias, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria all passed down that Mark documented Jesus' life, and they passed down that he documented Jesus' life under Peter's oversight. And Mark died in AD 62. So there's unanimous agreement based on the manuscript evidence we've recovered that have his name attached to it, and the unanimous attribution by Papias, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria by the 2nd century AD that he is the author. And since he died in AD 62, we know he must have completed the gospel before AD 62. Also on top of that, just to add weight to this, they say he documented it under Peter's oversight, and Peter died between AD 64 and AD 68. So Mark completed his gospel account before AD 62. Again, you can assume that Jesus isn't capable of what the Gospels say he's capable of, and then build a line of reasoning based on that, and just ignore all of this evidence, both the manuscripts and the unanimous attribution, and just say, well, this is my reasoning based on an assumption. Or you can say, maybe I can't prove this assumption, because you can't prove the assumption. And I'll operate based on the evidence we have. I'll operate based on knowledge instead of based on assumptions. And if you operate based on evidence and knowledge, it leads you to the conclusion that Mark was completed before AD 70 and must have been completed before Mark died in AD 62. Now, this should be solid enough to accept that the book of Mark really was finished before AD 62. But that's not even all of the evidence we have. There's even more evidence that Mark was completed before AD 62. The Gospel of Luke is the first part of a two-part work. Originally, Luke and Acts were 2 volumes of the same work. Now, there's evidence that Luke was finished before AD 64. And remember, Luke uses Mark as a source, one of its sources. So if Luke is finished before AD 64, Mark must have been completed even earlier. Now, the way we know that Luke and Acts were finished before AD 64 is because the book of Acts is really interested in helping Christians navigate persecution. The book of Acts records the persecution of Stephen and James, the son of Zebedee, and in the beginning we see Peter being beaten for his beliefs, and it wants to give Christians a Christian perspective on navigating persecution. So it records the death of Stephen and James, the son of Zebedee, Christian leaders in the church. But even though it's interested in helping Christians navigate persecution, and the book of Acts is really interested in Paul, it doesn't mention Paul's death. Paul was put to death by persecution for being a Christian in AD 64. So the book of Acts must have been completed before AD 64, where it would have mentioned Paul's death. It also doesn't mention James' death. James, the brother of Jesus, was put to death before AD 70. We know this from Josephus. But even though James was a leader in the church and Jesus' brother, who the book of Acts talks about, he was put to death before AD 7, and the book of Acts doesn't mention it. Also, in the Roman Empire, Nero started persecuting Christians to a wild, shocking degree in AD 64. We know about this mainly from Tacitus, a Roman historian. But the book of Acts, which is very interested in helping Christians navigate persecution, doesn't mention the persecution that is spanning the Roman Empire that the Roman emperor initiated in AD 64. This is solid reason to accept that the dual work of Luke-Acts is finished before AD 64. And since Acts is the second part of the work, it stands to reason that Luke was finished earlier. And they reference Mark as a source, which means that Mark's gospel must have been circulating even earlier, just as the evidence we looked at showed us. So it's possible that Mark is completed even as early as AD 45. So it's circulating somewhere between AD 45 and AD 62. Now remember that Jesus died in AD 30. So what this means is that there were multiple completed accounts, detailed accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection circulating within 15 to 30 years after his death and alleged resurrection that we're going to get into. So these sources are early and close to the time of what actually happened, very close, within 15 to 30 years. The next question is, can we trust the authors? Were the authors trying to convey what really took place? And there again is solid reason we can accept that the authors were trying to be honest about what happened. There are sources both inside and outside the New Testament that say that the early Christians suffered for believing and teaching what they believed. So again, inside the New Testament, the book of Acts is very interested in helping Christians navigate persecution. It records the persecution of Christians like Stephen, like Peter being attacked for his beliefs, like Paul being attacked for his beliefs, like James, the son of Zebedee, dying for his beliefs. Also outside the New Testament, Josephus in his Antiquities records James, the brother of Jesus, being killed by Jewish leadership. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records Nero's persecution of Christians, like we said, in AD 64. So inside the New Testament, we see Christians suffering for teaching what they believe about Jesus. Outside the New Testament, we see Jewish leadership and Gentile leadership, Roman leadership, attacking Christians for what they believe. This means Christians teaching Christianity was a dangerous thing. They were not gaining status. There was no incentive for Christians teaching what they believed unless they really believed that what they were saying was accurate and was true and needed to be said. There's also clues in the text that tell us the authors were trying to be trustworthy. If you open the Gospel of Luke, what you'll see is that in the beginning, he says this: "Since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence." So Luke opens his Gospel by admitting that he's not an eyewitness, but he's someone who's investigating what the eyewitnesses actually passed down. If Luke was trying to be deceitful and convince people of something that wasn't true, he'd probably say that he is an eyewitness and he can bear first-hand testimony. He wouldn't say that he is investigating what eyewitnesses have passed down. This tells us that Luke is probably expecting to be checked and is trying to do things honestly and accurately. In the book of Matthew, open in chapter 24, and you'll get this scene where Jesus says he doesn't know the hour when he's going to return. If Matthew was trying to put a gospel together that proved that Jesus is someone, even though Matthew knew he was lying about what Jesus said, he wouldn't include this detail that Jesus didn't know when he was going to return. The only reason that you'd expect to find that Jesus doesn't know something in the text of Matthew is if Matthew is actually trying to portray what really took place and isn't worried about how people are going to take it if it's not true. Another clue from the book of Luke that Luke is trying to be honest, and this is also in the book of John, that they're trying to be honest about what it is they're communicating, is that women found the tomb. This is really significant because remember that the resurrection of Jesus is the event that all of the claims made about Jesus in the New Testament rest on. Even the New Testament presents it this way, that because Jesus rose from the dead, we can have confidence to believe everything that he claimed about himself. But when the gospel authors tell us who found the empty tomb, who discovered that the tomb was in fact empty, it's women who found the tomb. This is really significant because during the author's lifetime, in Jewish culture, women's testimony was not considered valid in court. Women's testimony was looked down upon and just not considered reliable. Even in rabbinic literature from the time period, we find women's testimony is not trusted. But the gospel authors weren't as interested in convincing people in a way that was misleading or not true. They were more interested in recording what actually took place, even though they knew and were well aware that because they included the detail that women are the ones who founded the tomb, they knew that their peers who were reading this text would automatically discount that piece of evidence, or they wouldn't trust it as much. This would be a fact that would lead people away from believing it instead of leading people to believe it. They wanted people to believe. They wanted people to believe that this really took place, but they knew that when they recorded this detail, people wouldn't trust it. It was like an embarrassing fact to include. So they were more interested in recording what actually took place than convincing people by changing the truth. So we have history that says early Christians suffered, and the authors would have been well aware that by writing these texts, they were opening themselves up, exposing themselves to persecution for writing them. And there's clues inside the text that tell us they expected to be checked, and they were really trying to portray factual evidence the way things actually took place, and they weren't concerned with people not believing them because of details they included. The Gospels are early, and the authors were trying to communicate what they really believed happened. So the next thing to talk about is, did it actually happen? The Gospels are early, and the authors really believed what they were writing, but did it happen? I mentioned in the second video that there's a Christian scholar named William Lane Craig who's done a lot of work surveying what historians have written about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and the historical reliability of it. And William Lane Craig has found that there are 4 facts of the resurrection that historians agree on, whether they're Christian or not Christian. From all different backgrounds, historians widely agree on the following 4 facts. And in the next episode, we're going to start unpacking how we know all of those 4 facts and really why historians agree on them. Even if they don't accept that the resurrection actually took place, they widely agree that these 4 events took place. That Jesus was killed by Roman crucifixion and buried in a Sanhedrin member's tomb. That after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. That after his crucifixion, individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of him alive, and that Jesus' earliest followers sincerely believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about how we know all of these things actually took place, and so we can be confident that Jesus really rose from the dead.